This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Guillou, and I'm the curator here at the San Francisco Botanical Garden. While everyone else seems to start trickling in, I will kind of give a little bit of an introduction. So I'm very happy that all of you are here to attend our Magnolia speaker series. I'm really happy to have our guest speaker in today. I'll introduce him momentarily. But a bit of bookkeeping. This session is being recorded. Your cameras have been turned off and you've all been muted, but we would encourage all of you to provide any questions you have into the Q&A function at the bottom, and there'll be some time at the end for us to answer your questions. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker. This is Dr. Peter Zale, the Associate Director of Conservation, Plant Breeding, and Collections at Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania. And today he's going to give a really lovely photographic journey of his travels over his career, sharing with us how plant expeditions can lead toward ex situ conservation efforts, specifically with magnolias. But I'm sure we'll see a bunch of other really lovely images along the way. And with that, Peter, I will let you share your screen and go for it.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. Let me share the screen here. Okay, you should see my screen. Everybody can see that okay? Good to go? Okay. I'll just keep going. So thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the San Francisco Botanical Garden for having me speak. And I realized when I sent in the description, I didn't put a title. So I'm just going to talk about magnolias tonight. And what this really is a story and a collection of experiences and ways that I've interacted with the genus Magnolia over the last 15 years or so. And so I'm coming to you from Longwood Gardens, which is in southeastern Pennsylvania. So we are actually in the banana belt of Pennsylvania, if you can believe that. So southeastern Pennsylvania, we are USDA hardiness zone 6B, 7A. This winter has been a particularly tough one. Lots of nights down to 10 degrees with no snow. We don't typically go below 5 degrees, but we're a lot colder than most places on the West Coast. And, you know, winters are cold and dry. Summers are warm and humid. We get about 49 inches of rain a year, which results in really robust plant growth, hence the name Longwood, because of the geology here, the rain, the soils. Trees do particularly well. And not only plants from the southeastern United States grow well here because of our relatively mild East Coast climate, but also many plants from China and Japan and Korea, including the magnolias, do pretty well here. So if you're unfamiliar with Longwood Gardens, Longwood Gardens began in 1906 when industrialist Pierre DuPont bought the property and started the gardens here. And what Longwood is really known for are display gardens. And so we have a large conservatory complex where you see things like Echium Predii here, which is a difficult plant for us to grow. I know out in California, it's probably too easy to grow and perhaps even invasive in some places, but we grow it as the type of plant that, you know, you can't go and see at just any public garden. We do lots of indoor displays that are heavy in things like orchids and paracallis and other seasonal floriculture displays. If you were to come to Longwood in the summertime, one of the things that is most attractive and unfortunately is going to be closed for the next couple of years due to some construction are the water lily pools or the aquatic pools, where we grow a very large collection of water lilies and also put on display our Victoria water platters. And so those are the huge floating pads that you see there. It's not a large genus, Victoria. There's only 2 species, and the first hybrid between them ever made was here at Longwood, so that's kind of our namesake. But just, you know, wanted to give you a little background on the gardens, but I'm going to go back even further than the beginning of Longwood in 1906, and that's really going back to the time when the William Penn commissioners were selling off the land known as Pennsylvania. Long before that, this was the area of the Lenape people, and that history is still very present here. But looking at sort of the more Western aspect of the garden, the property was purchased from the William Penn Commissioners by a Quaker family named the Pierce family. And the twin great-grandsons of the founder of Longwood, George Pierce, became really interested in collecting trees, and they basically started an arboretum that was planted in late 1700s through the 1800s. And those trees, many of them are still at Longwood and really form the basis for many of the things that we do here. What figures very prominently among these collections was this particular tree, Magnolia acuminata variety subcordata. It's in the middle image. It's the tree on the right here. On the left side of that middle image is a large ginkgo tree, we think was one of the first in the US. However, the Magnolia is really important because we know that the Pierce twins were friends with William Bartram, John Bartram's son, who, famous American plant explorer, who had one of the first botanic gardens and nurseries here in Philadelphia. And we know that he had gotten plants from Andre Michaud. And so what we think is that this Magnolia acuminata variety subcordata, which is the southern variant of the widespread Magnolia acuminata, is perhaps traceable, and we have evidence to support this, that it is linked to Michaud's original collection, which is the type for this particular species. So it's a very historically valuable cultivar in that it links to the original description of the species and has this history attached to it. What's really fascinating about this tree is that you can see in the middle there, it's a large tree. It was, I think, about 100 feet tall. And if you read British gardening literature, Magnolia acuminata variety subcordata is often touted as this slow growing, compact magnolia that's great for small yards. That is clearly not the case in the mid-Atlantic United States, where it becomes much larger. So the size of the plant, I think the lesson here is that the size of the plant is really relative to the climate where it's growing. And so this is a very famous tree. Unfortunately, in 2020, when so many other things were happening, the original tree blew down in a vicious windstorm we had in one late April into early May. And so we actually lost the original tree. And you can see in this image, that's the trunk of the tree laying there. You can see the Pierce DuPont house. And if you look just in the back, you can actually see wisteria flowering right here. And so it was really sad to lose this tree. And the reason I mention this is not because it is a sad story, but the outcome, I think, is a good one, because Longwood Gardens has many historic trees, this Magnolia among them. And knowing that, trees don't live forever and that we have some really genetically superior trees that we want to perpetuate in the gardens, this tree was named as a cultivar and propagated 20 years ago. And so even though the original tree is not there, we have propagules from that tree, as you can see here in the image, that have already been planted in the garden. So even though the original tree is gone, its legacy lives on. And so if you look at the Magnolia collection at Longwood, where I work, Magnolias are really one of our most important collections. So like many public gardens, we have a living plant collections policy that we have written and really talks about, how we think about plants, how we strategize on curation of certain collections, how we want to build them. And Magnolia is one of these important collections, again, linking back to the legacy of the Magnolia Pierce's Park. And so we don't have a huge collection. We have about 62 types of magnolias, 287 accessions. Not many of them are of wild origin. And we have selected the one cultivar Pierce's Park, but we do have a unique collection. And as I go through this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about how we're continuing to expand it and, things we're doing to, to help bring new magnolias into cultivation. And ultimately what we're hoping to do is, if you're in the public gardens world, is for our Magnolia collection to become part of the American Public Gardens Association Plant Collections Network. And so really, I think through that, we'd be able to join other prominent Magnolia collections at public gardens throughout the country, but also elevate the importance of our collection as well. So many of the Magnolias here at Longwood, pardon me, are really selected for their display value. So because of the climate here, you know, we would love it if we could grow things like Magnolia campbellii that I know grows so well out there in San Francisco. That species and many of the others of more Western Chinese or Himalayan origin just don't do well here. It's just too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. But many things like Magnolia soulangeana that you see here in the image and other related species grow extremely well here and live for a very long time and really still serve as harbingers of spring. So you can see a scene like this one here coming up here in just a few weeks. And so Magnolia denudata, for example, does extremely well here. This is a tree here at Longwood planted by DuPont, so over 100 years old now. So some of these things do really well. And I think it's pretty much universal that anywhere these precocious flowering magnolias are grown, that, you know, late frost is always an issue. And, you know, in probably 1 out of every few years, we tend to lose the flowers due to a late freeze, but by and large, they do pretty well. And so as I was preparing for this presentation, I really sort of went back in my history of magnolias, and it really made me do something I was maybe not expecting to do, and that was actually look at my master's degree from Ohio State. And so when I went back to grad school in 2007, I had the opportunity to study magnolias and really use them as a model for learning basics of plant breeding and genetics and things like quantitative genetics, and really looking at how heritable characteristics are in plants as you want to select and breed for them. And so I did a lot of work with the Sweet Bay Magnolia, which is native around this part of the world. And I'm not sure how widely grown it is out on the West Coast, but in this part of the world, it is a very common landscape tree. And it's, despite its range, which is really in the coastal plain of the southeastern United States, where you tend to have wet, acidic, sandy soils, it's an incredibly adaptable tree. And so in Columbus, Ohio, where I was a grad student, the soil there is the opposite of sandy and acidic. It is the glacial till plain. And so it's very high in calcium. It's very clay rich. It's very dry in the summer. It's very wet in the winter. And it's not ideal conditions for growing acid loving plants. But lo and behold, Magnolia virginiana had done well planted in certain sites there. And I formulated a project where I was crossbreeding between the best ones that me and my advisor had found, such as the one in the image here, and making crosses between them. But we also wanted to build a reference collection of wild types of this species, you know, to look at them from a genetic standpoint, but also from a breeding standpoint. You know, was there useful variation or novel variation in terms of flowers or fruit or adaptability, or, you know, being deciduous or evergreen, that we might be able to use to select hardy plants. And so if you're unfamiliar with the Sweet Bay Magnolia, it grows in the coastal plain of the eastern US. So it's native in this part of the world. Longwood sits on the Piedmont, so just east of here. When you move into the coastal plain, like in southern New Jersey, pretty much all of Delaware, or the eastern shore of Maryland, Sweet Bay starts to pop up, and you see it along roadsides and usually growing along lakes and in wetlands and places like that. And it's really valuable because it is sort of partially evergreen, but it also has, you know, flowers that appear later than the precocious magnolias in our climate. So typically it flowers, about the 1st of May into mid-May. And it has these wonderfully scented flowers that smell like lemons, and especially on a late evening and in May, when it's kind of warm and humid, the smell, the fragrance is really quite potent and enjoyable. And it's got these great fruits that result from that too, that are, you know, very similar to pretty much every other magnolia fruit out there, but still showy and important for wildlife. And so we think about Sweet Bay out this way in a couple of different ways. There's basically 2 forms of the species. In the north, You have variety virginiana, which is a shrubby, sort of tardily deciduous plant that grows in wetlands. And as you move south and cross the Savannah River in Georgia, something happens and it becomes this canopy tree that gets 100 feet tall and is basically evergreen. And they are very closely related, and the genetics show that they're very, very similar. But from a horticultural standpoint, and certainly from a plant collection standpoint, they're really quite different. And so this gives you an idea of what the leaves look like of the southern form. And so there's other ways we like to think about sweet bay magnolia. And, my original project was just to think about it as sort of a landscape plant, or to, think about it in terms of these genetic studies and sort of what was happening with it in terms of evolution in the wild. But when you really start to dig into it, it's a really, excuse me, important wildlife plant. And so many of the swallowtail butterflies that we have on the East Coast are feed on the foliage of Magnolia virginiana. And so here's an example of that. So, from our perspective, this is a great plant to plant because it does have these ecological services as well that bring a whole new element to the garden, to the landscape, and as a restoration plant as well. So if you were to go, just to give you a little bit of a taste of what it's like to see Magnolia virginiana in the wild, these are a couple of images from the Pine Barrens in southern New Jersey. And if you've ever been out here or have read about the history or natural history of New Jersey, southern New Jersey is really a botanical paradise. And in terms of the East Coast flora, it's really where north meets south. And it's this incredible sandy landscape like you see here, with these huge aquifers underneath it and these beautiful clean rivers running through it. So you can get these uplands like you see on the left, where it's pitch pine and other very dry acid loving flora. And then literally the elevation could change by, 18 inches, and you're in a wetland. And the wetland is on the right. And you can see things like Chamaecyparis thioides, lots of orchids and other plants growing out in that meadow. And this is where sweet bay likes to grow, sort of at the edge of the forest where the Atlantic white cedar is growing, and sort of in areas that are maintained as open due to the high water table, or perhaps historically things like fire. But sweet bay is a fascinating plant because it chooses its environment really well, and it grows with a lot of really other interesting plants. And so if you go to a place like the New Jersey Pine Barrens, not only could you see sweet bay magnolia, but you could also see things like purple pitcher plants and grass pink orchids like you see on the left, but also things like Narcissus americanum, which you see on the right, the yellow flower, which is actually endemic to southern New Jersey. So it's a globally rare species, things called bog asphodel, that only grows in southern New Jersey, and that's the only place in the world. And so it's really quite incredible, as I was out looking for sweet bay in the wild, I would come across all these interesting places. And so it's really, for me, it's a great plant, not only because, I have this experience working on it, because it has all these other wonderful floral associations as well. And so in those places, we've been doing a lot of work at Longwood with native orchids. Native orchids grow in much of the habitat that sweet bay grows in. And here you can see a couple of them here, just to give you an idea. So if you ever want to come out and go to the East Coast and look for sweet bay, or just look for magnolias in general, you're bound to see lots of other interesting plants. And one thing I learned about sweet bay that I had never known is I was doing some field work in Georgia, and came across this plant right here, Macranthera flammea, the flameflower, which is in the Orobanchaceae, which is a family of hemiparasitic plants. And this is an incredibly rare and beautiful species. It's hard to tell from the image, but this spike of flowers is about 8 feet tall right here. And what's interesting is that this plant, it does photosynthesize a little bit, but it forms haustoria and sort of connects to other plants and gets energy from them. And one of the plants that it connects to is sweet bay magnolia. And so I know that some people in the South that are working with conservation of this plant have actually been able to grow Macranthera in a pot on the roots of things like sweet bay magnolia and its distant relative Liriodendron tulipifera, the tulip tree, which is very, very common in the East Coast. And so, beyond Sweet Bay being this incredible, and adaptable ornamental plant, it serves many other functions as well. And I think, this is something about magnolias that, really needs more consideration, all the things that they're doing in their natural environments, because it really seems to be remarkable. And the more people study about them, the more they realize that magnolias have all these ecological peculiarities that really need their stories told. And so what I'll talk about now is a little bit about my collecting throughout the Southeast from basically, this started in 2007 and went through 2009. And I wanted to show the range of Magnolia virginiana again. And so you can see all those green highlighted counties that you see in the eastern and southeastern US, including where I'm at here in Chester County, Pennsylvania. That is the known range of Magnolia virginiana. For a long time, it was thought to be endemic to the eastern United States until about 15 years ago. They actually found it growing in Cuba, of all places, which is really not that surprising considering that, it's really only as the crow flies, 40 or 50 miles from, the nearest population in Florida. So over time, over those 3 years, I did a lot of exploration, and you can see all the places, all those pins are places where I made collections of Magnolia virginiana, and some of them were really right in the heart of the range, and so are sort of the typical Magnolia virginiana that you might see on the market or in a nursery out here. But there's two particular places that I want to highlight that I think really get at the heart of why plant exploration is important, especially for things like Magnolia virginiana, which at least from our perspective is so common in the nursery trade. Why even bother? It's established. Why does it need to be improved? Why do we need new types? So I hope that the next couple of examples will help explain why that is. And so first, I'm going to talk about this pin right here, and this is Bethel Springs, Tennessee. So we can flash forward to Bethel Springs, Tennessee, and there's really not much to Bethel Springs, Tennessee. It's basically a one traffic light town in rural Western Tennessee with a town hall and a really unusual population of magnolias across the street from the town hall, which you see here. And so the reason that this population is so special is because it's the northernmost, most interior population of the southern variety of Magnolia virginiana. So Magnolia virginiana variety australis, and a very famous Magnolia file named J.C. McDaniel, who was a professor at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, would drive down to Florida on his vacation, and he discovered this population. And it's really interesting because of being so far north and being so, so far inland for an evergreen, large growing magnolia. So we went down because we wanted to get this into cultivation. And what we found was, you can see the population here, there's only about 20 trees in the whole population. And the site is well known because there's water bubbling up. So it's basically an artesian well. And people go there to harvest the water, and the water is also supporting this little population of magnolias. And so the first time we went there, we saw lots and lots of seeds. The people we were with would not let us collect any seeds off of the plants, only off of the ground. And if you know anything about collecting tree seeds, number one rule is never collect the seeds off of the ground, because what's likely to have happened is that the ones that have fallen off the tree and fallen on the ground while the others are ripening are probably damaged by insects in some way or otherwise inviable. So the first time we went, we collected a bunch of seeds, we got nothing. We went back, collected more seeds, and were able to successfully grow them. So the one thing we know about this is that even though it's a really small population of trees, it seems to be really robust and really healthy. And so here's an image of one of my associates out there collecting the seeds, sort of an action shot there, pretty typical day in the field. But what was sort of disconcerting about all of this is that As I mentioned earlier, this population of Magnolias is literally right across the street from the Bethel Springs Town Hall. Magnolia virginiana is listed as an endangered species in Tennessee. It only grows in 2 places in the state. This one here in Bethel Springs, and then another population in the east near a place called Turtletown. But what we had found was that despite this designation as an endangered species, that did not stop the power line companies from coming in and spraying the trees off of the power lines at the nearby road. So unfortunately, the last time I was there, they had damaged a lot of trees doing this. Hopefully they didn't kill them. And we were able to, from that, get a lot of these into cultivation. So, and then distribute them from beyond that. But, we felt like it was important to share this information and also to update the history of this, because nobody had really been paying attention to this population of plants since J.C. McDaniel was going there and writing about it in the MSI bulletin. So, so another shot of what it looks like. Unfortunately, the site is a bit overrun by kudzu and other invasive species, but again, the magnolias there are quite large, so hopefully they can withstand the pressures of what's happening there. So as always with plant collecting, we do. I've done a lot of plant collecting in the past through grad school, just on my own, and it's one of my core responsibilities here at Longwood. And what we always try to do is collect seeds, right? So it's really important if you want to maintain genetic diversity and really grow on big numbers of plants. Seeds are a really critical way to do that. And so you can see with the fruits, if I'm sure everybody's familiar with magnolia fruits, you can see them there. So what we would do is ideally we would collect the fruits before the seeds have started to pop out. We take them, we dry them out, collect the seeds, get the red pulp off of there, give them about 90 days of cold stratification, bring them out of the fridge, plant them, and then away they go. And so I love magnolia fruits. There's something very gratifying and very rewarding about collecting magnolia fruits. So the venture to Bethel Springs did end up being a success. And so as I was developing this collection of magnolias from collecting sites throughout the US, I was also trying to learn more about cultivars of this species. There's been a lot of cultivars selected over time, and so I thought I'd share some of the best ones with you with the off chance that maybe you would like to grow this species or are more interested in it. But some of the best, Green Shadow is a really interesting one, and we grow this one here at Longwood. It's one of the most remarked on magnolias that we have in the collection because it's one of the most evergreen of the Magnolia virginiana types. And I mentioned collecting in Bethel Springs. And I mentioned another population of Magnolia virginiana in Tennessee in Turtletown. Green Shadow was collected by the nurseryman Don Shadow in Turtletown, Tennessee. And so, I'm very intrigued by this idea of cultivars being named, but still being traceable to their place of origin. And as we think about, conservation of magnolias and many other plants, I think, we need to do a better job, or at least a thorough job of making sure that these stories and this provenance data that's linked with some of these cultivars goes into the record so that people who might be doing restoration or genetic work or any kind of work where they need to know that have access to that information. So Green Shadow is a really important one for that from that perspective. One that we struggle to grow here in the north is this one, Maddie Mae Smith, which is a variegated plant. This is incredibly beautiful. There's a specimen of this at the Norfolk Botanic Garden here on the East Coast, which is only 200 miles from here, but is probably about 2 hardiness zones warmer. And so it's so very mild there. In the wintertime, they can grow this really well, and it's a really beautiful plant. But again, it's, many cultivars of these plants come out onto the market and they're all the rage for maybe a few years, and then they just kind of go away. And this is an example of that. So, some of these things I think, need to be in public gardens if they aren't already. Perhaps the most unusual of all of the Magnolia virginianas are these dod small leaf or little leaf forms. And so Tom Dodd and his family were nurserymen near Mobile, Alabama, and they found these Magnolia virginianas that are really unusual. And it's hard to tell from that picture, but if we look at this one, you can see on the right-hand side that these are forms of Magnolia virginiana that have leaves that are about, I don't know, a quarter of the size of typical. And the flowers are small too, and they're just really unusual. And again, all found in the wild and, traceable wild origin. But again, they were found sort of one time by one person and never found again. And other people have looked, but it's been hard to find. There is some thought that because of the hurricanes in that area and other things that, the original plants have long since been destroyed, but they are maintained in cultivation. And, every aspect of the plant is tiny. Here you can see one of the fruits in my hand from many years ago. And they have a much different habit than other Magnolia virginiana, kind of looking more like a shrubby small tree than a canopy tree in the forest. And so I wanted to just give you an overview of a few cultivars. There are many others out there. It's really not my intention to go through all of them, but I am going to switch gears back to Magnolia virginiana as it grows in the wild and really focus on this plant right here. And this is called Magnolia virginiana, and I put in quotes, variety ludoviciana, because it's a name that was applied to plants of Magnolia virginiana collected from the westernmost part of the species range in sort of western Louisiana and Texas, so west of the Mississippi River. And that name is given to many plants collected from that region. I don't know exactly the reason why or the link in the history, but the name as applies to this magnolia was published illegitimately in a nursery catalog. And so it's not accepted by the botanical community, but it's accepted in horticulture. And what we found was that of all of the Magnolia virginiana that we collected from throughout the species range, and this is talking in Columbus, Ohio, zone 5, where it regularly gets to -10 in the wintertime. This is one of the best, if not the best, selections or groups of Magnolia virginiana to cultivate in that region and really maybe in general. And what's fascinating about it is that it has these huge leaves that are sort of fuzzy and deciduous, enormous flowers, enormous fruit, and a really strong tendency to reflower. And so it's not uncommon to see this with both fruits and flowers on it. And this is something that it repeats in cultivation. And I show a size comparison of the fruits here. You can see this is variety australis as it typically is. This is, variety virginiana, variety australis, and what we're variety ludoviciana. And so these really large fruits are really quite attractive. So we did all this collecting and all the plants went to Ohio State and we grew them on there. And I think some of them are even still there. But one of the important things we realized was that we had way more than what we needed. And so we did a lot of effort to distribute some of the products of our collections to other public gardens. So the Boone County Arboretum, which is in northern Kentucky, right near Cincinnati, the U.S. National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. We sent replicates of all of our collections, the most important collections. And what they also found was that, especially at Boone County Arboretum, like you see here, the variety ludoviciana that we collected is the best performer. And so it was, again, totally off the radar of horticulturists. But what we have found is that, and this continues to this day now, 15 years or so, 14 years into this trial, and the results every year just confirms that this particular selection is probably the one we need to be growing. So I feel really happy that we're able to add at least a little bit to maybe the working knowledge of this particular species. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I'm done with Magnolia virginiana and just talk a little bit about Magnolia fraseri in particular. And there's a picture of it here, but just wanted to give mention of all of the other magnolias that we have here in the eastern United States. We have I wouldn't say a very rich magnolia flora, but certainly enough species to make things interesting. And so Magnolia fraseri, unlike Magnolia virginiana, is really a mountain species. It's really a species of the southern Appalachians, and it's one of the big leaf magnolias. So it's related to things like Magnolia macrophylla and Magnolia tripetala. And like them, it has these big leaves that can be up to, I don't know, 12, maybe 15 inches in length. And they have this beautiful kite shape. It's really an incredibly beautiful plant, but you almost never see it in cultivation. And so as I was doing my work on Magnolia virginiana, I would take the long cut, so to speak, and drive from Columbus, Ohio, down through the southern Appalachians. And I started making collections of this species because I wanted to try to get it established in cultivation. And so just like I did with Magnolia virginiana, I created a map of all the collections. So you can see here, starting in West Virginia, sort of working down through into Virginia and the Carolinas and even into South Carolina, and making all of these collections. And so, you know, one great thing about doing this work was, you know, most of the elevations I was dealing with for Magnolia virginiana were more like 40 feet above sea level. You know, the nice thing about Magnolia fraseri is it gets you up into the mountains and you get to go to these really beautiful and scenic places. And so the habitat of Magnolia fraseri looks something like this. So as you get up into the mountains and, you know, you get out to these areas that are rich in rhododendrons and ericaceous plants and mountain ash and things like that, that's where you tend to find Magnolia fraseri growing. And so here it is in situ, growing next to a seepage stream up in, this is in Western North Carolina. You can see the Magnolia here growing in this very moist area with things like rhododendron maximum, Canadian Canada hemlock, and other cool loving plants. These are the flowers of Magnolia fraseri. It's a beautiful, huge flower, and this has one of the best fragrances, I think personally, of any Magnolia out there. And growing in its habitat, you do get some other interesting plants like this one right here, Diphylleia cymosa, the umbrella leaf. It's hard to see, but those leaves are really quite big, 12, 15 inches in diameter. And the fascinating thing about this plant is that it's in the barberry family. So it's related to Mahonia and barberry and epimedium and things like that. And you can't tell from the image, but these beautiful blue fruits, if you were to clean those, it has these bright red seeds inside that look just like little rubies. So again, I was there for the magnolias, but I'm always trying to pay attention to all the other things around. And so working through there, I was able to make collections of Magnolia fraseri seeds. A lot more difficult than collecting Magnolia virginiana. The Magnolia fraseri, unfortunately, especially when it's in the forest, seems to flower only at the very tops of the trees. So you need some really long pole pruners, or you have to be a really good tree climber. Otherwise, it can be tough to collect the seeds. But I was successful and able to collect some seeds. So another thing, just to sort of tie in with that, and I know this is a species or a taxon that many other people at public gardens are working on, especially in the Southeast, is that there's a southern variant of Magnolia fraseri that grows in the coastal plain in habitats that are kind of similar to Magnolia virginiana. It's called Magnolia fraseri subspecies pyramidata. Some people just call it Magnolia pyramidata. So it's basically a coastal plain version of that species. And there's a lot of thought that Magnolia fraseri is a bit hard to grow, and it's hard to get established in gardens. There's some thought that, you know, with the changing climate, with things heating up, that perhaps pyramidata is a better choice for cultivation. And you know, they're both very beautiful plants, but they both seem to be equally difficult to propagate and establish in the garden. So I know that a lot of people are working on this right now, and I really wish them well and hope that you know, they have some success. I was able to grow lots and lots of seedlings of Magnolia fraseri, and what the strange thing about them is in the same unheated polyhouse with seedlings of Magnolia virginiana, they were much less tolerant of the freeze and thaw conditions that our polyhouses will experience. Whereas Magnolia virginiana, you can freeze and thaw out the pot all winter long. If you do that to Magnolia fraseri, which actually comes from a much colder place, it cannot handle it. And so we actually ended up losing almost all of the seedlings due to that. So lesson learned. But Magnolia pyramidata is one I'm hoping to get back out and collect. This is its habitat here. You can see these rich forested hardwood forests along the south coast. You can see here what it looks like, and very occasionally you can actually see one of the flowers at eye level, and they smell just sort of like juicy fruit bubble gum if you haven't ever smelled one before. So quite an intoxicating fragrance. And then these really bright, beautiful red fruits. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm coming up to the end of my presentation. And so the things that I've talked about already with regard to Magnolia virginiana and fraseri, I did that work a long time ago. And so more recently, I've been working at Longwood Gardens, and we've been able to make collections of a variety of magnolias through some other plant exploration efforts that we've undergone in Asia. And so I'll talk just very briefly about some work in a collection we made in Western Hubei in China. We've been doing a lot of work in Vietnam. And then we also do a little bit of work going to nurseries in places like Japan. But I'm particularly interested in the work in Vietnam because the partners that we have there have the wonderful ability to give us access to go into places like you see in the image here. So this karst landscape in Kaobang province, this is very, very close to the border with Yunnan province in southwestern China. And typically, for foreigners, what we have found is that accessing these border areas is typically a no-go. But because of our partners, we're able to get in there and we're able to do floristic surveys and assessments and even make some seed collections and really, be able to explore in these areas which are closed off to Western people. And so one of the things that we were working on in Vietnam was actually down in the southern or central highlands of Vietnam, near the city of Dalat, which is a few hours to the northeast of Ho Chi Minh City. And we had gone there. I went there in conjunction with a partner from the Atlanta Botanical Garden, who also does a ton of magnolia work. But we were really interested in the pine that you see in this image, and it's called Pinus kremphii. And it's a really unusual pine because it's endemic to a very small portion of the Central Highlands in Vietnam, and it's a relic species, and it's also incredibly large. So you can see in the image here, these are the trees growing up on the side of the mountain, and some of these things are estimated to be, maybe even 1,000 years old. And it's a really interesting pine because the needle is long and it's sort of flattened and it's plasticky in texture. It's kind of like the Japanese umbrella pine, Cyadopodes verticillata, if you're familiar with that one. But it's a really interesting and unusual pine that is not in cultivation, and it's actually most closely related, as discovered through DNA sequences, to Pinus strobus, which is the eastern white pine, which is one of the most common pines here on the East Coast. And so we had gone down to try to collect this pine or collect seeds of it. Very, very difficult because the cones are born only way out on the ends of the branches of these enormous old trees. And so we're still trying to figure out exactly the best way to get them. But while we were there, we were able to do some other exploring and collect this particular species, Magnolia lamdangensis. And this is a very recently described magnolia from that part of the world. It only grows in the Duc Nui Bai National Park and their environs. And the extent of the seeds we're able to collect is that fruit that you see right there in the image. This is a tree that's normally, 90 or 100 feet tall. The flowers are way, way up in the canopy and impossible to see and more impossible to collect. But for whatever reason, there's a single flower that bore this nice fruit with lots of seeds in it. So we were able to collect, I think, 22 total seeds. 11 of them were sent back to Longwood. We got 6 seedlings of that. And what we found was that my partner, his seeds got delayed in the mail. They didn't germinate. And so we ended up with the only 6 plants of this that we knew about outside of Vietnam. And so one thing that we're really trying to do more, especially with these really rare and important plants like this, is give them to people who live in places and have a directive to collect magnolias who can grow them and can keep them in their collections. And so we sent 2 of them to the Atlanta Botanical Garden and then 2 of them to the San Francisco Botanic Garden, because I suspect that based on where it grows in the wild, your mild climate, lack of humidity and heat in the summer, and then the mild winters, I hope will really be to its liking, and hopefully it will do well out there. For us, we've kept 2 of them. It's strictly going to be a conservatory plant, but my hope is that as the seedlings gain size and grow, we can plant one in our conservatory, and maybe one day you can come and see it in flower. So we haven't done a ton of collecting of magnolias in Vietnam. We're hoping to do more, and we're hoping to expand that work. And really, we're just now Vietnam is opening back up for us to be able to do this kind of work again. So we're hoping we can continue on with this. We've done a little bit of work in China, and I think there's still a lot of work that could be done there with magnolias. I was fortunate to go to Western China in 2018 to this area, which is called the Shenangjia Forest region, and it's incredibly rich in lots of plants that really do well in our neck of the woods. But one of the things I'm getting ahead of myself, but so this is the Shenangjia Forestry region. You can see this is Hubei province. Here's the infamous Wuhan right here. So the west of that particular state is really rich in terms of the flora and in terms of the mountain landscape. And this is really, if you think about the early plant hunters like Augustine Henry and Ernest Henry Wilson, this is really one of the first places they explored. So it was cool to sort of retrace their footsteps, but also to go back there and to make collections of things like this, which doesn't look like much, but this is Magnolia beyondii, just growing next to the road near a mountain called Dulingshan. And this is a rare species in cultivation. And so, this trip, magnolias were a target, and we were able to make a few collections: Magnolia beyondii, Magnolia springeri, Magnolia denudata. And so, magnolias are one of those groups of plants. It seems like no matter where we go and no matter what we do, they seem to be there and they're present. And so they become part of the collections and part of what we're doing. And I'll just end by showing a little bit about nursery hopping in Japan. Japan has probably one of the richest, oldest nursery industries in the world. And it's incredible what you can go there and find. And I'm sure many have heard the stories about how Japanese nurserymen or nursery people will specialize in one particular group of plant, and that's still very true, but you always find really interesting things. And to me, this yellow leaf selection of Magnolia obovata was really quite captivating. And this is kind of a one of a kind. And if you ever go shopping for plants in Japan, take a lot of money, because people there are very accustomed to paying big money for plants. So like the plant in the image there, you could have that for like a cool, I don't know, $2,000 or something like that. It was not inexpensive, but it's just to show that, people have been going to Japan and buying plants and bringing them back to the United States for a long time. And, for as long as that's been happening, there's always new stuff out there, that could be valuable to collections and that sort of thing. So that was my presentation. So thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Peter. While my camera is figuring out how to turn back on, please, everybody, add any questions you may have. There we go, to the Q&A function. But are a few questions that are popping up. So one of them, Peter, also, by the way, thank you. That was really engaging and lovely photos.
Good.
So are you still continuing your research with Magnolia virginiana, or is that sort of a side project, but maybe not the forefront of your work nowadays.
It's not, we kind of gave that work off to like the U.S. National Arboretum, Boone County Arboretum. Others are doing that. I know that there was an APGA U.S. Forest Service grant that I worked on a few years ago in conjunction with partners from the Morton Arboretum, Morris Arboretum, to make more collections of virginiana from this part of its range, the northern end. And so, we didn't actually take any of those, but they went to other gardens. And so, we're not doing the work, but we're still sort of in the periphery of it. And so, because it is such an important species, but it is great to see that, collections that I made so long ago are still growing. That makes me feel like that all that was a success, and to see that others have been able to build upon that. So, we continue to be part of it, but it's definitely not focused right now.
Cool. No, that's very interesting. Another question. So kind of mentioned the Magnolia virginiana that occurs in Cuba. And so we have our Mesoamerican cloud forest here at the Sanford collection at the San Francisco Botanic Garden. And it's really interesting how a lot of these, what we consider very temperate East Coast species, move their way into Central America, but go very high up in elevations to go south, like
Right.
liquid amber and other oak species, and Magnolia macrophylla. So does Magnolia virginiana do the same in Cuba? Does it go up in elevation, or does it remain as a lowland species?
It's a lowland species. I mean, I think it's growing basically right at sea level, like, because as you move into southern Florida in the Everglades, Magnolia virginiana is one of the most common trees, and it's
there's no elevation down there, so
yeah, there's no elevation, right? It's like sea level. And I think, I've seen they originally called the Cuban one subspecies ovidoi, I think, or something like that, named after the guy that found it. They did the genetic work and found that it's basically the same as the stuff in Florida, and it's growing basically in the similar sort of like, river of grass, saturated landscape.
Oh, that's cool. Very nice. Oh, awesome. So really interesting stuff about your work in Vietnam, and I would say I'm very excited that we have the Magnolia lambdongensis in our collection. Also frightened that I had no idea you only had 6 germinate, and we are the recipient of 2. So one, I'm very hopeful that ours will be successful and grow well, but also alarmed at the same time. But what kind of habitat does that species grow in? Is it a cloud forest species, more of a more lowland? Yeah, like what kind of elevation?
I don't remember the elevation. It's not super high up, but it is cloud forest, and
Cool.
so it's basically, in Asia they say, there's a dry season in the winter, and from what I understand, if you're in the mountains, that means it doesn't rain every day, only every other day. And so, like where Magnolia lambdongensis is growing, and there's also Magnolia bidupensis, it's basically, yeah, it's cloud forest. It's damp all the time, moss covered, very rich, lots of epiphytes, constantly clouds rolling in, always spitting rain. So it's it's kind of a rainforest plant in a way.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So I imagine you have many more trips to Asia planned, but is there a new spot to look for magnolias that you're itching to get to? I know magnolias have such a broad range, Southern Asia
Right.
and Southeast Asia and Papua New Guinea. Is there a spot that you have your eye on that you'd like to go?
I'd really like to get back to China. I think, obviously there's a really, really rich history of people collecting there, and there is still so much that can be done. And I know, I remember how many dozens or 100 species of magnolias in China, and many of them are very rare and not in cultivation. And, we can grow some of the broadleaf evergreen Chinese magnolias here. So I think it's something we need to try more of. But I would say that, Vietnam is like a magnolia factory. I mean, I think, it seems like every year there's 2 or 3 new species, and I think they're up
between there and Yunnan. It's like, what doesn't occur there? I'm not too.
Yeah. And I think now they're up to like 45 species in Vietnam. So there are things there like Magnolia grandis we'd love to collect, and some other things. So, the great thing about magnolias is when you're in that part of the world, you're bound to run into some, and there's a good chance you might be able to collect some seeds.
That's amazing. It sounds that way. Just gonna keep
Yeah.
tripping into them. Well, one more quick question. So there's a question on how do you spell the one in Columbus? You referenced I'm guessing Magnolia virginiana variety that was in Columbus. And
Oh, well, so what we did was for the project is, people had planted landscape plants in Columbus. And what we did was my master's advisor had sort of made a mental note of which were the best. And so we used these trees that were cultivated to sort of form the basis of this breeding program for adaptability. So there aren't any native there, but what we tend to grow there more is the northern form of Virginiana. So Magnolia virginiana, variety Virginiana.
gotcha.
Hopefully that answers it.
Yeah, I think so. And if not, then we can always reach out again.
Sure.
So, well, it looks like we're out of questions, but I'd love to thank you again for this amazing talk, for your fantastic contributions to Magnolia conservation as a whole, to our collection here at SFBG. And I know I'm really excited to work with you further on some of our grafting projects, and
All
they're
right.
starting to ramp up. So I think there's gonna be a lot of really great Magnolia species being shared across the country, and hopefully get some more trips in. You can bring some other really great threatened species back for us to preserve in our collections.
Yeah,
So,
love to help. So
yeah. Well, with that, thank you so much. I know it's getting quite late for you, and many thank yous again.
okay, thanks for having me. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
You take it easy.